The Maternal Thread by C.J. Van Pletsen. The Settler's Shadow. The South African soil was redder than Zuriel expected. It clung to his boots as he walked inland from Cape Town, toward the low hills and green valleys of the Western Cape. His destination, anonymity. His goal, permanence. Zuriel Smit, former legionnaire, fugitive, and bastard of Prussia, arrived with nothing but a forged name, a vision, and a hidden fortune sewn into the lining of his coat. Several rare Prussian coins, a folded document bearing the faded crest of the Hohenzollerns, and a hand-drawn map. The coins would feed him for now. The map, that was the future. The settler's mask. By 1916, he was no longer Zuriel Smit in public. The name that had followed him through blood, ruin, and exile had grown too sharp, too recognizable in the wrong ears. In the dusty settler towns north of Stellenbosch, he went instead by Lars Smit. It was a name chosen not from chance but from memory. Amar, in one of his old tales of Rome, had once spoken of conquerors returning in triumph, their brows bound with laurel. Laurus, crown of victory. To be crowned with laurel was to be marked as one who had prevailed where others had fallen. Zuriel had never felt crowned, never felt honored, but victory cold, unyielding remained the only justice the world respected. The earth itself seemed to welcome his disguise. The South African soil was redder than the fields of Europe, richer, almost bleeding beneath the sun. It clung to his boots, reminded him that every step was claimed by histories older than the settlers who had seized it. The hills rolled like a sleeping beast, vineyards creeping across their slopes, their roots drinking deep of stone and centuries. Here, he thought, he might vanish into the folds of time. He began low, as always, a farmhand on the lands of a Boer family whose sons had all been claimed by the Anglo-Boer war sons who had carried rifles against the English and never returned. Their grief hung like a veil over the homestead, but grief could be a door, and Zuriel knew how to walk through doors others left bolted. He carried wood, turned soil, tended livestock, and most of all listened. He learned their language, its guttural music. He learned their prayers, their resentments, the names of the men they still cursed by firelight. Slowly he earned their trust. Not as a friend, never as a friend, but as something quieter, more enduring, a presence they depended upon. It was then that the game began. His first acre he bought under their names, a gift they barely understood until the papers bore their signatures, then another parcel, then another. Always through proxies, a neighbor here, a cousin there, men with debts or daughters or both. The deeds spoke in voices that never mentioned him, yet his shadow stretched across each boundary stone. He became a ghost behind auctions and transfers, a figure whispered about but never named. He played the long game, as Amar had once commanded. To endure is to conquer. He never stayed too long in one face. He shifted hats, dialects, and manners as easily as others changed coats. To the English inspectors, he was another Boer hand with little English. To the Boer farmers, he was the quiet one with steady eyes and Protestant diligence. To the auctioneers, he was a rumor in the margins of their ledgers. No one saw him whole. Miriam. In 1919, he married. Her name was Miriam van Tonder. She was the only daughter of a Dutch Reformed pastor whose sermons thundered against sin and the creeping ways of modernity, but whose household bore the stillness of wheat in the wind. Miriam herself carried that stillness. Her hair was the color of ripened fields, her skin pale as unturned earth. And yet there was fire beneath it all, a quiet strength that no sermon, no father, could claim as its source. Miriam was not merely loyal. Loyalty could be blind, could be bought. She was discerning. She saw him not as a stranger wrapped in shadows, but as a man carving a place in stone with his bare hands. And though she never named it, there were moments, small, almost unremarkable, when her words carried the weight of another time, another voice, as though she herself was a vessel for something older than her bloodline. The first such moment came on a night thick with Cape rain. Zuriel had returned late from a land auction, his boots caked in mud, his shoulders heavy with the weight of gold exchanged for acres that would never bear his name. The storm rattled the shutters. Miriam waited by the hearth, lamplight bending around her hair like a crown of fire. She looked at him for a long time, not with suspicion, not with anger, but with the strange patience of one who reads a page no one else can see. "Some ground is not worth the seed," she said, her voice calm as rain on stone. "Even if it's free, the roots know where they belong." He had thought it then, a remark about farming, about soil, about yield. He nodded absently, weary and distracted. Only much later, as circles of men gathered around him, men of dubious loyalty, men whose hunger stank of betrayal, did he realize Miriam had not been speaking of land at all. She had been speaking of men, the ground they tilled in his shadow, the seed he scattered without care, the soil that would not bind to him no matter how much gold he pressed into it. Miriam never questioned his past. Not because she was incurious, her mind was sharp, hungering for threads, but because she understood that her role was not to pry open the doors he had bolted behind him. Her calling was to guard the threshold of the new. She was not his confessor, nor his spy, but something rarer, a keeper. And in her silence, there was a covenant deeper than speech. At night, when the storms receded and the land lay washed and new beneath the stars, Zuriel would watch her sleep. He wondered at her presence in his story. Was she a gift or a test, a crown or a chain? She slept with her hand often resting lightly upon his chest, as though to remind him that beneath all the names he had taken, all the masks he wore, there was still a man of flesh, a man of blood whose heart could betray him if he forgot to listen. And sometimes, just sometimes, he allowed himself to believe that Providence had led him here not to hide, not to flee, but to root himself in soil that might yet accept him, a family in the Cape. She gave him a son in 1921, then a daughter in 1923. The house that had once been a modest whitewashed cottage framed by Cape oaks and thorn-fenced fields, now filled with the sounds of infant cries, lullabies hummed in Dutch, and the measured pacing of Zuriel, though now he was Lars long after the others had gone to sleep. He named the boy Frederick, not in honor of the Kaiser, nor in reverence to any Prussian crown, but in a private act of defiance mockery sharpened into legacy. Frederick, the name that had once humiliated him in the orphanage rolls, that had branded him unwanted, bastard, misfit. Now it would adorn his heir, not as a mark of shame, but as a seal of triumph. The world would bow to a Frederick of his making, the girl he named Elsa, after no saint, no queen, but after a fragment of memory, the only kind-eyed nurse who had ever once bandaged his hand when he was still a child in Berlin's orphan wards, a kindness he had not forgotten. Perhaps, in naming his daughter so, he believed he was paying forward a debt the world had never asked him to repay. The estate. He built Estes Wine Farm as one builds a fortress stone by stone, vine by vine, with patience that could outwait seasons and storms alike. The name Estes carried no local meaning. It was a cipher, a sound that whispered of east, of origins, of suns rising. No one knew its source, and no one questioned it. The land was harsh at first. The soil resisted him, stubborn and unyielding. But Zuriel understood resistance. It was the language of all things worth possessing. He mapped the hills as a general maps a battlefield. He studied every slope, every trickle of water. He carved terraces against erosion, planted cover crops to shelter roots from the Cape wind, designed channels to pull rainwater into underground cisterns. Where others farmed with instinct, he farmed with strategy. He hired freedmen who still bore the invisible chains of generations, and Portuguese immigrants whose calloused hands carried the memory of Atlantic crossings. He paid them more than the neighboring farms would dare. He housed their children in cottages with thatched roofs and taught them letters when no one else cared if they could read. And so a loyalty was born, not from fear, but from recognition. They called him boss, but their eyes did not lower when they said it. And always, he watched. He kept journals in a script no one else could read, measuring rainfall with precision, recording soil acidity with the same discipline he once used to note troop movements and supply lines. He charted the way the moonlight touched the vines, the way the fog rolled in from False Bay, the subtle heat stored in granite and released into the roots at night. He designed barrel aging methods that relied on night air, building cellars with ventilation patterns stolen from cathedrals he had once seen in France. Other winemakers came to him for counsel. They marveled at how his vines thrived where theirs withered, how his grapes carried fragrance beyond their soil. He listened to their questions with the polite patience of a host, yet gave them only fragments. He was generous in manner, but never in substance. He always knew more than he shared, for knowledge was his true estate, and secrecy its stone wall.